Thank you. Yeah, so I'm going to quickly provide a few reflections from the last decade of research on integrated landscape approaches that our team has been working on. So yeah, next slide, please. Next slide, please. Previous slide. Okay, so the previous slide was basically illustrating the evolution of integrated landscape approaches. So from, okay, we need to go back to now if possible. But basically the emergence of many forms of integrated approaches, integrated natural resource management, ecosystem approaches, integrated rural development, etc., throughout the 70s, 80s, informed by conservation science, working at a broader landscape scale. And then more recently, in the past decade, there's been, this proliferation, if you like, of these so-called integrated landscape approaches or their synonyms. A recent study showed that there's at least 80 synonyms of an integrated landscape approach. Yeah, and they've been embraced by all of the big conservation NGOs, multiple development agencies, and they're increasingly funded as well. So the UN agencies are also advocating for these more integrated approaches, whether it's the UN CBD, the Global Biodiversity Framework, or the UNFCCC, or most recently the Global Land Outlook report from the UNCCD also explicitly mentioned integrated landscape approaches as a pathway towards transformational change for landscape management. And then so onto this slide, why are they so popular? So integrated landscape approaches might aim to do one, or in most cases, many of the following things that you can see on the screen there. So whether it's enhanced resilience, improved governance, conserve biodiversity, etc., these approaches aren't single sector, they're not single stakeholder led, they're trying to bring together multiple stakeholders across multiple sectors and working at a larger scale. Next slide, please. Okay, and then there's been two recent review processes in the last few years, one led by ourselves at CIFOR and partners, which showed the increasing implementation of these types of approaches. And our review focused on the tropics. And as you can see, we found evidence across all tropical regions, and a number of approaches that spanned across regions as well. And then there was also another, next slide please, led by the Landscape for People, Food and Nature Network. And theirs was a global review. So they covered four continents, and they found almost 500 examples of integrated landscape approaches. Next slide, please. But despite this widespread implementation effort, what our subsequent review found is that there's still limited evidence of the effectiveness of these approaches. And what was shown in the LPFN reviews was that the methodology that was used to develop that data set was basically came from practitioners, and it was self-reflection on the type of approaches they were implementing. And this was supported in our review, published in 2017, which you can see we had 174 case studies, like I said, from across the tropics, and 79 of those case studies were reporting successful outcomes. But when we dug deeper into the data, we were only able to find 15 examples that had what we would call credible data. And interestingly, from those 174, we didn't find a single example that showed any unsuccessful outcomes, which, you know, if we're honest with ourselves and if we understand these types of approach to be complex and, you know, multi-scale and long-term, then we would expect unsuccessful outcomes. In fact, you know, one of the key principles of landscape approaches is understanding that there's going to be trade-offs, and then, you know, using that information to forward plan. So while it's somewhat of a positive story, there's so many successful examples, there isn't really a credible evidence base available to us at the moment which we can learn from. And this was supported by our subsequent kind of more mini review published in 2020, where we concluded by saying that despite the enthusiasm for landscape approaches, the evidence base remains poorly developed. Next slide, please. So in the last few years, there's been a number of publications that have come out that have, you know, tried to identify the challenges to implementation. And this one from 2 years ago from Dorothy Vermont and colleagues suggested that the main problems fall within these 4 categories. So problems related to participation, interaction, resource problems, and institutional. And you can see, I mean, you can all read those problems listed there, but you can see there's some overlap amongst those problems. And these also support some of the challenges that we identified in a 2016 paper as well. And there's been a number of other papers that have been published in the last few years that have identified similar challenges. But I think definitely, you know, there's obviously consensus starting to show that there's limited capacity for implementing integrated landscape approaches across levels. There's challenges with engaging multiple stakeholders, particularly stakeholders that don't necessarily have a history of working together. With regard to resource problems, it says limited financial resources. I think also there's a time problem there as well. So we said in our publication that there's a time lag between understanding how to do the work and then the work happening. So a kind of knowledge implementation gap. But what we're finding with our current projects that we have running in Zambia, Indonesia, and Ghana is that there's also the time given to these processes. So it's also challenging to get people to invest that time without incentive structures there. And then, of course, you need the financial resources to provide those incentives sometimes. And a major challenge is how you ensure the long-term continuity of such approaches. And then interaction, institutional problems, again, how to manage kind of institutional structures across different scales, and then how to incorporate differing visions and what success means to different people. Next slide, please. So despite all those challenges, there has been some research that's published in the last couple of years that have shown some of the potential of integrated landscape approaches, and indeed shown that integration does underscore performance. So the top paper from Carmenta et al., published in 2020, used the data set from the LPFN network and managed to map out the different levels of integration across the different types of intervention. And what they showed is that those that are more integrated in their nature had more successful outcomes. And then the paper on the bottom in People and Nature, which is due to come out soon, compared 4 different types of intervention. So on the left, as I'm looking at the FLONA and the RESEX, are 2 sustainable use reserves, and then the 2 on the right are the less integrated approaches, a protected area and a intensive soy intervention. And what the graph or the bubble chart show is that on the top line you have positive outcomes, and the larger bubbles you can see are on the more integrated approaches on the left. So they're more positive and more of them, and then contrastingly the less integrated have more negative and more of them. Next slide, please. And also, more good news is that application of integrated landscape approach principles can lead to transformational change. So 2 papers that again came out in 2020. One showed, one was in Ghana, one was in Uganda, and one showed that effective implementation could lead to a forest transition. So they were particularly focused on reforesting Ghana's degraded reserves using the landscape approach principles. And then the Uganda study showed that application of principles increased capacity, reduced conflict, made more clarity on mandates, roles and responsibilities, and provided opportunities for policy influence. So again, these are positive signs. There are caveats to these studies. They are quite small scale, particularly the Ghana one, and they're new studies, so they're obviously not long term, so there's still plenty more learning to be done there. And another note with this is they use the landscape approach principles that were developed by Sayer et al. In 2013, which is a hugely influential paper and has been cited over 1,000 times. But these are 2 of the few examples that have actually applied those landscape approach principles despite the 1,000 or so citations. So we need to learn more from application as well. Next slide, please. So moving forward and some potential research opportunities. I'll go through these and try to spend a little bit of time on each. So across science, policy and practice, there remains a need for a better understanding of how to do integrated landscape approaches. So I think in our paper in 2017, we said that conceptualizing integrated landscape approaches still remains nascent. I think in the last few years, understanding has definitely developed a lot. And I think there's a better understanding now of what an integrated landscape approach is. But I still think there's some confusion with regards to the different terminologies used. The fact that one landscape approach doesn't exist. There's many different types of landscape approaches. So I think there's potential to improve how we define or characterize these types of approaches. And there's definitely scope to improve the methodology, the tools, the indicators that we need to use. And then within integrated landscape approaches, there's a need to recognize and harmonize plural values. And I think, this has been well recognized in the previous session, the fact that if you're trying to engage multiple stakeholders, there's going to be different objectives and needs. And so I think landscape approach needs to do a better job of recognizing those different values. I think that's something we're quite proud of in the projects we have going, particularly in Zambia. We've got a PhD student, Malika, looking at local knowledge systems and how we can incorporate those voices into decision making.
Thanks, James. Can you wind up, please?
Yeah, sure. So the private sector is an important but often absent actor. Again, we have research on this, but there's not enough been done of how we engage the private sector, why we should engage them, what are the benefits for local people, but also what are the benefits for private sector to engage. I need to better understand cross-scale dynamics. So again, this is a huge one, but could open up questions about how power relations manifest, how institutions that don't have that history of working together might engage better, how to reconcile local, national, international objectives. We need to question ourselves, do landscape approaches reinforce existing inequities? And I think, Kim opened up by saying CIFOR has led the agenda, but we need to have a bit of self-reflection and ensure that we're not dictating the agenda, if you like. I think I've talked about how to ensure continuity. We need to consider research fatigue and erosion of trust. What constitutes success and who benefits? We need to move away from the dichotomous language of success and failure and understand that there are long-term processes that are going to have trade-offs. But we need to use the opportunity of this seemingly increasing political will for these types of interventions, and also the increasing funding opportunities that are being made available. Okay, that's it. Sorry for taking too long.